Hi, this is Ted, and for the next hour, you'll be listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And we'll start with this one. Carney pulls Canada closer to Europe as both struggle with Trump. And this is by Martina Stevis-Gridneff. Canada and the European Union are turning commiseration and anxiety over their turbulent relationships with the U.S. under Trump into a deepening bond. On Monday, Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada joined a summit of European leaders in Yerevan, the capital of Armenia, putting his country at the heart of some of Europe's biggest priorities. He was the first non-European head of government to be invited to the gathering known as the European Political Community Summit. Mr. Carney's relentless pursuit of new expanded alliances to lessen Canada's dependence on the United States, coming as Trump threatens to unravel decades of economic integration, has effectively led Canada to be welcomed as something of an honorary European Union member. Integration is being used as a weapon by some, and the rules are not constraining the hegemons, said Mr. Carney on Monday at the Yerevan summit, hinting at but not mentioning the United States in comments that echoed his landmark speech in Davos, Switzerland in January. In that speech, he described what he called a rupture of the post-war world order led by the United States and called on middle powers like Canada and its European partners to band together to form a new, stable global system within which they can work together. It's my strong personal view that the international order will be rebuilt, but it will be rebuilt out of Europe, Mr. Carney said in Yerevan on Monday. European leaders appeared delighted that Mr. Carney made the long journey from Ottawa to Yerevan to spend a few hours with them. It is truly a case of, in such an unpredictable world, where friends are getting fewer and further between, having Prime Minister Carney around this table not only matters to us and the citizens we represent, but I think also shows Canadians that we are willing to go further with a country that we could be very easily much more integrated with, said Roberta Metsola, President of the European Parliament. The meeting in Yerevan took place against a backdrop of a string of bad news for Europe emanating from White House decisions. Last week, Trump announced that he would order the withdrawal of 5,000 U.S. troops stationed in Germany, and separately that he would apply a 25% tariff on EU vehicles despite a trade agreement between the U.S. and the bloc. The meeting in Yerevan brought together European Union leaders with other allies, including Ukraine and Britain, under the auspices of the European Political Community, a group created in 2022 following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it meets twice a year. It's the first ever time that we invite a non-European country to participate in the European Political Community, said Antonio Costa, the president of the European Council. But we invited Canada because Canada is one of the closest countries in the world to Europe. It is the most like-minded country, and we share a certain vision of the world. We need to keep calm and carry on with the United States, he added, but our transatlantic relationship is not only with the United States. Mr. Carney last year negotiated to make Canada part of the European Union's joint defense industry policy, a partnership that will allow Canadian companies to bid for EU procurement contracts. Canada and the European Union are also negotiating a new, broader strategic partnership that will enhance trade in other areas of collaboration and is likely to be agreed upon this year. Ms. Metsola said Canada would be a desirable source of energy and critical minerals for the European Union, as well as a partner in the bloc's efforts to expand its own artificial intelligence companies. On Monday, Mr. Carney announced that Canada would contribute 270 million Canadian dollars, or about 200 million US dollars, to a NATO-led program to quickly provide Ukraine with urgently needed military provisions. Asked about whether the U.S. troop withdrawal from Germany worried him, Mr. Carney was circumspect. Obviously, it's of interest and of some concern, speaking for myself, the potential adjustment in U.S. troop forces, but the details are less clear at this stage, and it has to be put against the backdrop of very, very, very considerable American resources, including personnel. But, he added, the withdrawal should be seen as part of a world where Canada, Europe, everybody in that room is taking more responsibility for collective defense. Mr. Carney is under pressure at home to show that his outreach to the European Union and other partners and his approach to the U.S. will make Canada economically stronger and more resilient. While Canadians elected him a year ago to stand up to Trump, there is also broad consensus among voters that a new, stable trade deal with the U.S. is necessary to secure Canada's economic future, but one may not be available anytime soon. Well, the Pulitzer Prizes were awarded today, and here's a very brief article about a play that I actually saw in New York and really liked, and so I thought I'd share this article with you. It's called Liberation, a memory play about 70s feminism wins Drama Pulitzer, and this is by Michael Paulson. Liberation, a funny, probing, and powerful new play by Bess Wall that explores the women's movement of the 1970s through the eyes of participants in a small consciousness-raising group, on Monday won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama, one of the most prestigious honors in the field. The Pulitzer Board called the play a striking blend of comedy and sincerity that explores the legacy of the consciousness-raising feminist groups of the 1970s, using the story of the playwright's mother to demonstrate how the movement grew out of conversation and that anyone experienced the play has joined the discussion. Wohl, in a telephone interview shortly after the announcement, called the prize a huge honor. She said she had been wanting to write a play about the legacy of second-wave feminism for about 15 years. She had written, workshopped, and discarded several drafts, and then, during the coronavirus pandemic, had interviewed more alumni of a consciousness-raising group and finished Liberation. I just feel incredibly grateful that the play was recognized, and it's really meaningful to me, especially now, at a time when women's rights are under assault, along with the rights of many, many Americans, she said. This is a play about people coming together and trying to change the world for the better, and I feel grateful to be able to put that message out into the world right now. The play is set in a basement basketball court at an Ohio recreation center. The narrator is a contemporary woman trying to understand her mother's early activism and traveling back in time to explore the consciousness-raising group. The play is partly inspired by Wohl's own life. Her mother, Lisa Cronin Wohl, a writer who was a Ms. Magazine contributor, belonged to a similar group in the 1970s. Liberation had a Broadway run this season, opening in October to unanimously strong reviews. Said Elizabeth Vincentelli in the New York Times, the miracle of this play is that the circle feels as if it is extending to embrace us all. Not only does its sustained pace make the story downright suspenseful, we quickly become invested in these women and wonder what will become of them. But spending time in their company is also an unadulterated pleasure. The play, directed by Whitney White, struggled at the box office. Side note, we got tickets without any trouble at all, which surprised me. The subject matter and the lack of well-known stars made it a tough sell, and it closed in February. Even before the Pulitzer announcement, Liberation had a post-Broadway future. Several prominent regional theaters are expected to stage it over the next year, including Studio Theater in Washington, Berkeley Repertory Theater in Berkeley, California, and Geffen Playhouse in Los Angeles. Before arriving on Broadway, Liberation had an off-Broadway run early last year at the nonprofit Roundabout Theater Company, where the Times critic Jesse Green called it gripping and funny and formally daring. Wohl, a 50-year-old New Yorker, had one previous play on Broadway, Grand Horizons, in 2020, and is also known for her breakout work, Small Mouth Sounds, which ran off-Broadway in 2015. The other finalists for this year's Drama Pulitzer were Bowl EP, a lyrical play about a lazy romance between two skateboarding musicians written by Nazareth Hassan, and Meet the Cartosians, exploring Armenian American identity at two moments a century apart, written by Talin Manahan. And here are a couple of articles about the environment. 1. Do spinning wind turbines really mess with radar systems? By Eric Niller. Wind turbines create two problems for radar on ships and for ground-based systems looking for aircraft. The steel support towers can reflect electromagnetic waves, making it more difficult for radar to pick up nearby objects, while the rotating blades can create a blade flash on a radar screen, appearing to be another object where there is none. Pentagon officials in recent weeks have blocked reviews of 150 onshore wind farms, citing issues of national defense and radar interference. Trump has called wind farms ugly and expensive and has vowed not to allow them to be built. But researchers who study radar interference say the problem is manageable by using new technologies and by adjusting where companies build wind turbines. Hao Ling, a professor emeritus of engineering at the University of Texas at Austin, participated in government studies looking at radar interference from wind farms in 2013 and 2022. He said there will be some interference. That's the nature of the physics, but it's a solvable situation. A 2024 report by the Energy Department stated that new technologies and collaboration between federal agencies in the wind industry have enabled federal radar agencies to continue to perform their missions without significant impacts, and have also enabled significant wind energy deployments throughout the United States. To cope with wind farm interference, newer solid-state radar systems can be adjusted to eliminate some of the disturbance from the rotating blades. Turbine blades can also be coated with radar-absorbing carbon or other composite materials used on stealth aircraft to dampen some of the distortion. Experts also say that the shape of towers and blades can be designed to make them a smaller target for radar signals and can lessen the scattering effect. In 2023, Republican lawmakers asked Congress's watchdog arm, the Government Accountability Office, to look at the potential impacts of offshore wind farms, including how they might affect military operations and maritime navigation. The GAO convened a panel of 23 experts and consulted with the Defense Department. The GAO study found several ways to solve the problem, including making some areas off limits or temporarily turning off turbines during military operations, according to Frank Rusko, Director of Natural Resources and Environment at the GAO. Dr. Rusko said the interference issues are the same whether the turbines are on land or at sea. The physical properties of the wind farm that can disrupt some radar would be the same. Interference from wind farms can cause problems for ground-based radar used to track aircraft, but does not affect radar used by aircraft flying above the turbines, he noted. Since late last year, the Interior Department has tried unsuccessfully to halt 5 offshore wind farms in various stages of construction along the Atlantic coast, citing national security concerns, but federal judges dismissed those arguments. Scientists, engineers, and federal regulators have worked together for more than 15 years to manage interference. The Energy Department tracks the location of 75,727 wind turbines in 45 states and territories to help military and civilian planners. Dr. Rusko said wind farm developers and the military had discussed the issues of radar interference before, during, and after the process of picking a site for proposed wind turbines. That's a really important piece from a national security standpoint, he said. And a related article, you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And here's another article. Home on the Range No More. Trump wants bison gone. This is by Jack Healy. Crazy Alice, a half-ton bison, likes to feast on grass and roll in the dirt. But her deepest attachment might be to a certain corner of the Montana prairie. When her handlers once moved her herd to a different pasture, she tried to break out and go back. Now the Trump administration wants to evict Crazy Alice and hundreds of other bison from that home on the range and replace them with cattle. The resulting clash on the prairie has pitted ranchers and Republican leaders against a furry, snorting symbol of the American West. Said Allison Fox, executive director of American Prairie, a deep-pocketed nonprofit that has spent 2 decades buying ranches and grazing leases on public land in northern Montana to create the newly embattled home for bison. This is part of our country's heritage. The conflict centers on 900 bison owned by the group, which was allowed by multiple administrations, including Trump's first, to graze on federal lands, much to the consternation of politically conservative ranchers who wanted the land for cattle. This winter, the U.S. Bureau of Land Management reversed course and canceled the bison grazing permits. Citing the Tailored Grazing Act of 1934, the agency said the federal grasslands where the animals grazed should go to livestock being raised for food, not bison largely enjoying their right to roam. The agency deemed the bison to be wildlife, not production livestock. Conservation groups condemned the decision, as did Native American tribes, who said the anti-bison effort threatens their own herds as they try to revive bison populations that were hunted to near extinction by 19th century settlers. But Montana ranchers like Perry Jacobs celebrated. She said the federal government, a perennial boogeyman for Western conservatives, finally seems to be on her side. These lands are here for food, she said, whose family has raised cows in northern Montana for nearly 110 years. We have to understand that progress and time march forward. Bison just don't fit on the landscape anymore. Pro-bison environmental groups accused the Trump administration of bowing to pressure from Governor Greg Gianforte of Montana and ranching groups that had pressed the administration to rule against bison grazing. Said Ryan Buss, a Democrat running in a primary in Montana's 1st District, I don't think it's actually about the bison. Gianforte is fine with oil companies doing whatever the hell they want on public lands, but some bison walking around and eating grass is a threat? The state's powerful land board, which includes Mr. Gianforte and other high-ranking Republican elected officials, is also taking steps toward kicking bison off Montana's state trust lands. We must ensure that public lands remain accessible and productive rather than being locked away for the vision of special interests, Mr. Gianforte said after the federal permits were canceled. American Prairie argues that cows and bison can coexist and is trying to undo the Bureau of Land Management's decision. The Bureau, it said, scrapped decades of successful land policies by arbitrarily redefining what constitutes livestock in the American West. If the final decision goes into effect, potentially later this spring, American Prairie says it will have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to alter fence lines and haul bison away from the lands where they belong. And here's an interesting article. It's called, What Would the Nation's Founders Think of Trump? 250 years later, here is the answer. This is by Stacy Schiff, who is the author of The Revolutionary, Samuel Adams, and she's at work on a book about Benjamin Franklin. What would the Founding Fathers say? You can't write about American independence, especially this year, without fielding that question in every variation. To which political party would George Washington belong? What would Ben Franklin think of the tech bros? How would John Adams feel about failing to land a role in Hamilton? What would Thomas Jefferson make of the National Museum of African American History and Culture? And of course, how would any of the founders reckon with a president who accepts extravagant gifts from foreign powers, puts his face on a 24-karat gold coin, and commemorates the 250th anniversary of American independence with a mixed martial arts event on the White House lawn? In a few cases, we actually know the answers because in the summer of 1776, Franklin, Jefferson, and Adams signed the document we know as the Declaration of Independence. The Continental Congress had inflicted some 86 changes on Jefferson's draft, changes that landed like daggers to his heart. In the end, though, the members agreed to the text, affixing their names and pledging to the new nation their lives, fortunes, and their sacred honor. Only in the early 19th century did the document acquire its cult status, becoming our North Star, our creed and covenant. Nearly a half century after he had written it, Jefferson explained, quote, "It was intended to be an expression of the American mind." As it turns out, then as now, the American mind was exploding with grievances. Most of us can rattle off at least part of Jefferson's incandescent opening, but the next 650 or so words were the reason he composed the thing in the first place. They were the lines Congress worked over most obsessively. In the words of Samuel Adams, they represented a catalog of crimes of the deepest dye. They made the American case in the most concrete terms that King George III was guilty of every kind of abuse of power. In Jefferson's accounting, the king had undermined the rule of law, the common good, the judicial system, and the political process. It seemed there was little he had not corrupted. By the time Jefferson had finished, he had, as the historian Richard Bell has put it, turned King George into Nero, Richard III, and Attila the Hun, all rolled into one. For many who read the litany today, the resonance is unmistakable. So if you really want to know what the founders would say, you might do worse than review a selection of our founding 27 grievances. The non-hallowed parts of the Declaration were the parts too incendiary for many 18th century British newspaper, the libretto to Jefferson's familiar soaring aria. In 2026, they also feel miserably familiar. First one, he has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. Jefferson opened with a broad claim asserting, as had any number of colonial petitions, that the Crown obstructed perfectly beneficial laws. What was shocking then is an almost daily occurrence now, as the current administration has endeavored to repeal science, mutilate history, cripple essential services, gut standards, corrupt the administration of justice, dismantle the oversight of government, undermine higher education, silence the free press, deprive the armed forces of effective leadership, thwart the political process, and line its own pockets, all at once. Next item. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. By dictating policy to its governors, the Crown overrode the will of its constituents. That's classic executive overreach, and a favorite maneuver of Mr. Trump, who has tried to block California's climate regulations, ding Colorado's artificial intelligence regulations, and withhold funding for the Gateway Tunnel connecting New York and New Jersey. Trump deemed the tunnel a future boondoggle, a remarkable claim from a man who ordered a military parade on his own birthday. Next item. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. Jefferson accused King George of trying to disenfranchise whole swaths of Americans. In February, Kristi Noem, who was then the Homeland Security Secretary, announced that the Trump administration had, quote, been proactive to make sure we have the right people voting, electing the right leaders to lead this country. Trump has insisted that Congress pass the Save America Act, which could prevent millions of Americans from voting. This spring, he signed an executive order that sought to limit mail-in voting. Next item. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. When the Massachusetts Assembly seemed in danger of passing laws that irked the king, the royal governor forced the legislature into recess or removed it from its Boston location. If it could not meet, it could not vote. Last July, when the U.S. House was considering forcing the release of the Epstein files, its members were sent home early for the summer to avoid holding a vote that would irk Trump. It seemed like a foolproof idea at the time. Next item. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. The colonists were eager to expand their ranks, which they understood to be essential to the American future. In 1773, however, they lost the right to naturalize immigrants, and the colonies erupted in fury. The Trump administration has issued a list of 75 countries from which applications for immigrant visas will not be processed, including Somalia, after Trump accused Somalians of completely taking over Minnesota. Only white South Africans need apply. Next item. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. When the Crown decided to pay colonial judges directly, planting the judiciary beyond the people's control, the news arrived like thunder in the ears, as Samuel Adams put it. Those charged with dispensing impartial justice became, Adams argued, pawns of the king. Is this different from Trump's attempt to curb rogue judges, or the denunciation of judges who do not rule in his favor as corrupt and deranged, or the dismissal of immigration judges who failed to deport people fast enough? Next item. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. At the front of Jefferson's mind were the customs agents the Crown dispatched to collect revenue that the colonists considered extortionate. They find their modern equivalent in the IRS agents whom Trump has reportedly planned to weaponize against political opponents, or in DOJ, which terrorized government employees whose sole offense was doing their job. Next two items. He has kept among us, in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislatures, and for quartering large bodies of troops among us. A decade before the Declaration, Franklin warned Parliament against dispatching troops to peaceful North America. They will not find a rebellion, he predicted. They may indeed make one. 4 years later, civilians and troops faced off in central Boston on the evening we remember as the Boston Massacre. Minneapolis this winter returned it vividly to mind. Boston residents appreciated the troops housed in their public buildings about as much as the citizens of Minneapolis took to their occupiers, who were equipped with a selection of gear for close quarters killing. Next, he has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states. Even mock trials would deliver more accountability than we've seen for the killings of Renee Good and Alex Pretty. Stephen Miller, a White House deputy chief of staff, specifically told ICE agents that they had federal immunity and that neither city nor state officials could interfere with their duties. Judge Patrick Schultz of U.S. District Court in Minnesota reproached the agency for defying nearly 100 court orders in 1 month alone, more, he said, than some federal agencies have violated in their entire existence. For cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent. The colonists protested taxation without representation. Trump goes further, taxation without any hint of logic. He has imposed tariffs as high as 145% and then proceeded to change them, by one tally more than 60 times, before the Supreme Court declared the entire effort to be unconstitutional. Trump justified his tariffs any number of ways, though he's also invoked them to prosecute grudges. As Canada discovered when the president took offense at a political ad, and as our European allies discovered when they objected to his aggressive interest in purchasing Greenland. To me, Trump has said, the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariff. For depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. No colonist was ever actually departed for trial abroad. London did, however, search for the legal means by which to remove various opposition leaders. In the end, no legal justification was found and no action was taken. The rule of law prevailed. The Trump administration has outdone King George, detaining and deporting American residents to countries where many of them had never before set foot. Trump has said he's considering doing the same for some U.S. citizens. Next item. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. Quick pause. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The central question of the 1770s was this: if the colonists were treated like enemy aliens cast from the king's protection, did they owe him allegiance? Here we are again. The Trump administration has said that it is rescinding $1.5 billion in health and transportation funds from blue states. It has sought to block their FEMA relief. It has canceled more than $7 billion for clean energy projects, decisions that, according to a ruling by Judge Amit Mehta of U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia, the administration openly admitted it had made based on whether the awardee resided in a state whose citizens voted for President Trump in 2024. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. Enough said. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy of the head of a civilized nation. With this grievance, Jefferson was clearly turning up the heat. So is the Department of Homeland Security, which recently reported that it hired more than 12,000 officers and agents in 4 months. The department has done so using extremist language, with slogans seemingly borrowed from white nationalist groups. Who needs foreign mercenaries when you have a heavily armed, lightly trained domestic force? The declaration cannot be said to be having a happy semi-quincentennial. Very little about the document feels remotely self-evident today. Certainly it has come in for a beating before it managed to recover. In 1857, Abraham Lincoln declared it had been, quote, assailed and sneered at, and construed and hawked at, and torn till, if its framers could rise from their graves, they could not at all recognize it. That was another inglorious moment in the wake of the Dred Scott decision, which flew directly in the face of a proclamation that was, as Lincoln observed, held sacred by all. The sacred principles are very well and good, but it is possible that in this document that defines us, that has made us who we want to believe we are, a subject on which we seem universally even to agree. We've been memorizing the wrong part all along. The libretto may matter as much as that indelible aria. At the end of his inventory of abuses and usurpations, Jefferson slips in a zinger. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. And an editorial called Operation Epic Fury, Meet Operation Colossal Blunder. This is by Scott Anderson. America's war with Iran has entered a calmer phase. Diplomatic posturing, on and off again negotiations, and endless wrangling of a settlement. This, of course, is far preferable to the annihilation of Iranian civilization that Trump was threatening just a few weeks ago, but it raises questions of just what has spurred this turnabout. The answer is rather straightforward. The American and Israeli bombing of Iran failed to provoke either a popular uprising against the regime in Tehran or its capitulation, however painfully slow Mr. Trump and his advisors have been to acknowledge that. Instead, Iran discovered its ability to shut down the vital passageway of the Strait of Hormuz and send the global economy into chaos. There are now only two outcomes to the conflict. Either the kind of wholesale destruction of Iran that Trump posited, or a settlement that will leave the government intact and empowered, and a blustering American president humiliated. The first option is increasingly remote. By publicly threatening the commission of war crimes on an enormous scale, Trump has given both his domestic and foreign opponents time to marshal resistance. As for the latter and more likely outcome, This was predictable if only the president and his administration had bothered to take note of a new feature of modern warfare, a feature that can be boiled down to a single word: drones. The weaponized drone has utterly transformed today's battlefield. It's the modern-day equivalent of the machine gun of World War I. Because of the drone, the vastly outnumbered Ukraine military has been able to withstand the Russian army of Vladimir Putin for the past 4 years, not only inflicting far greater casualties on the invaders than expected, but doing so at a cost of pennies to the dollar. As the Ukrainians have shown time and again, a $1,000 drone can destroy a roughly 4.5 million T-90 tank. While the Russians have recently made significant strides in drone warfare, this simple weapon has ensured that they're grievously paid for their war, both on the battlefield and in the pocketbook. Much of this same dynamic has played out in Iran for the past 2 months, although without the staggering cost in human lives. Certainly, American and Israeli warplanes can bomb Iran's military infrastructure at will, and they have tens of thousands of times. But no amount of bombing can remove the primary retaliatory weapon at its disposal. On the contrary, Iran can continue to mass produce drones at a fraction of the cost of the weapons being produced by the other side. What Trump called his excursion in Iran has already cost the United States at least $25 billion, according to the Pentagon, and significantly depleted its stockpile of sophisticated missiles. That depletion is already causing shortages in other strategic arenas and could take years to replenish. All the while, with their cheap and plentiful drones, assembling a top-of-the-line Shahed 136 drone costs Iran an estimated $35,000. Iran continues to dictate the terms in the Strait of Hormuz choke point. But what about continuing the American naval blockade of the strait, or launching a ground assault on Iran's shores, as Trump has also periodically proposed? Granted, matters might get ugly, but surely this will lead to American victory and an end to the impasse, right? Wrong. Build out an ironclad blockade, or put 50,000 American troops on Persian Gulf beachheads, and the Iranians will still retain the ability to fire a drone over their heads to hit an oil-laden tanker and paralyze the global economy anew. The future security of the Persian Gulf now depends on the Trump administration cutting a deal with the regime in Tehran. Despite the president's assertion that we have all the cards, almost the exact opposite is true. It is Trump, rather, who is increasingly motivated to cut a deal and staunch the growing pain to the U.S. economy and his collapsing approval ratings at home. As a result, Iran is likely to try to drag out negotiations and extract greater concessions from Trump in the process, knowing that time is on its side. Those concessions might involve a lifting of the onerous maximum pressure sanctions that Trump imposed on Iran during the first term and restored early in his second, or reparations for the destruction that the American and Israeli bombing campaign has inflicted. While a chief point of contention will be the stores of enriched uranium that remain, any final settlement will almost certainly leave Iran as the de facto gatekeeper of the Persian Gulf, or in other words, in a far stronger position than before Trump started this war. The standoff in the Persian Gulf underscores both a lasting and frightening shift on the modern battlefield. While specific, critically important sites can undoubtedly be made drone-proof, the White House, for example, defensive shielding on a large scale is impossible, as Israel has now discovered with its much vaunted and much punctured Iron Dome. Given the simplicity and cost of the weaponized drone, every one of the world's geographically strategic choke points, the Panama and Suez Canals, the Strait of Gibraltar, and the airspace over New York, is now vulnerable to attack by a hostile force that has the ability to build such a weapon and a willingness to suffer the consequences. Alarmist? Think of some of the apocalyptic regimes or murderous guerrilla groups of the recent past, the Baader-Meinhof gang in West Germany, or the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, or bin Laden's Al-Qaeda. And imagine what they might have done with a $2,000 weaponized drone. When the American attack on Iran was launched in late February, the name chosen for the operation, Epic Fury, seemed an unusually apt description of the temperament of the man ordering it. In pondering where that military misadventure leaves both the U.S. and the future security of the world, a more fitting name might be Operation Colossal Blunder. And for a bit of a change of pace, here's one called Lauren Sanchez Bezos and the Fashion End of Times of The Devil Wears Prada 2. And this is by Robin Given. When I look at photographs of Lauren Sanchez Bezos, I see someone who loves fashion, although not at all in the way I do. My affection for it is rooted in respect for its beauty and creativity, and in a fair amount of skepticism because of its stumbling acceptance of its social responsibilities. Her version of fashion exudes personal indulgence and broad disregard. A plutocrat by marriage, she represents the industry's ultimate customer, with its ever-rising prices and shrinking sales. Fashion is pricing all but the most astoundingly wealthy out of the market. In the just-opened film The Devil Wears Prada 2, Justin Theroux plays a dastardly, acquisitive tech titan named Benji Barnes, with clear echoes of her husband, the billionaire Amazon founder Jeff Bezos. The Barnes character happens to have a girlfriend who might remind you of Mrs. Sanchez Bezos. Their thirst for clout helps drive the film's plot. On Monday, Mr. Bezos' real-life hundreds of billions of dollars will propel Mrs. Sanchez Bezos up the Grand Fifth Avenue staircase of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, past a gauntlet of photographers and into the Costume Institute benefit, better known as the Met Gala, over which she and he will preside as honorary co-chairs. The Institute's exhibition this year, Costume Art, is made possible by the Bezos largesse, but the couple is so broadly unpopular in the fashion world and beyond that there were calls for a boycott of the gala. Beyoncé is also supposed to be there, serving as an official co-chair, along with Nicole Kidman, Venus Williams, and Condé Nast's chief content officer, Anna Wintour. But Ms. Sanchez Bezos is the star of the Met Gala because she represents what fashion, buffeted by social and technological change, has surrendered to: economic inequality in human form, with pink, glossy lips cinched up in a couture corset. Taste is one more part of the culture for ruthless tech titans to attempt to optimize for their benefit. With Ms. Wintour's determined gatekeeping and the Costume Institute's intellectual concerns about human creativity, the Met Gala is the perfect laundromat for soulless tech money. Both The Devil Wears Prada and its sequel stage fictional versions of the Met Gala for the camera and star Meryl Streep as Miranda Priestley, a fictional version of Ms. Wintour. The first film captured the fabulousness of the fashion world. It also worked to give viewers the sense that its haughty, judgmental inhabitants were hard at work, helping to make small lives feel bigger by the decisions they made huddled in a room going through, quote, a pile of stuff. I think about how the sharp-tongued Miranda might view Mrs. Sanchez Bezos. A corset? In an evening gown? Groundbreaking. The sequel depicts Miranda with her power and influence slipping. She's confronting the same tidal wave of financial challenges that the real-life fashion ecosystem is navigating. On screen, the upheaval comes by way of data-driven technology, an awkward tycoon with no sense of style, and the fashion-loving woman he aims to please. As Stanley Tucci's character Nigel says, he's reduced to creating content that people scroll past as they pee. In real life, fashion magazines and publications in general are in trouble, and they're hoping the right billionaire will bail them out. Parentheses, the Bezoses have been rumored to be considering buying Condé Nast, Vogue's parent company. When asked about it, Mrs. Sanchez Bezos told the writer Amy Chozick, "I wish," and then, "No," end of parentheses. With her donations, scholarships, and grants, Mrs. Sanchez Bezos offers the industry some support beyond her expensive shopping habit. The Bezos Earth Fund awarded $34 million in grants to institutions developing environmentally neutral fabrics, and she directed $6.25 million from the Earth Fund to the Council of Fashion Designers of America to support innovation and education in sustainability. The industry readily grabs on. Some people are betting that she's the right billionaire. According to Ms. Chozik's recent profile of her, Mrs. Sanchez Bezos just wants to be happy. And whenever she steps in front of cameras, dressed in a remarkable array of finery, she looks delighted. In an era of economic inequality and financial instability, when California is looking to institute a billionaire tax and a tax on second homes in New York City is under consideration, Mrs. Sanchez Bezos moves about with ostentatious pleasure. She counts her 10-figure blessings and wears her windfall on her back for all to see. Her taste veers outside a palette of beige and gray cashmere, the approved sensibility of well-mannered, quiet money. She's willing to flash a wide smile or offer a pouty stare for the cameras, rather than stare them down with an expression of bashful reserve or detached ennui, which is what serious women are supposed to do. She does not have the body of a 6-foot-tall, 12-year-old boy, which is how high fashion still insists on defining an elegant female physique. She defies these expectations, something that could be lauded, but she simply embraces a different cliché, an extreme version of femininity that's defined by a snatched waist and a cantilevered bosom. She laments how little the public really knows about her, but provided the opportunity to tell her critics more, she refrains. She's told the Times, "I'm not talking politics. No, 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 no way." It's reasonable to believe that since she sat in a place of honor behind Trump during his inauguration, she might have a few thoughts about the current administration. Mrs. Sanchez Bezos, who once worked in broadcast news, acknowledged the importance of journalism, but offered no thoughts on her husband's drastic staff cuts at the Washington Post, which he owns and where I used to work. But she's willing to express her exasperation that the white lace bra readily visible under the Alexander McQueen suit she wore to Mr. Trump's swearing in caused an online kerfuffle. She defines the problem as a scandal about lace, not her disregard for the dignity of an official function. To draw the cameras, it helps that she has hired one of the best stylists money can buy, Law Roach, and collected an impressive array of very expensive stuff. She's done so from a feast of options, costume not as art but as merchandise. Perhaps she even scrolled past some of it while she was indisposed. As Miranda deftly shivved a would-be white knight, "You're not a visionary, you're a vendor." Ms. Sanchez Bezos' clothes don't demand that the public pay attention to her story, or even the stories of the designers she wears, or really even fashion. She has assembled a tote board of Bezos wealth, and if it tells any story of all, it's his. And you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And some letters to the editor. Here's a letter from Palo Alto, California, about the election in Virginia. Can anyone really be perplexed that Democrats are embracing gerrymandering, or that Republicans are selective in their indignation over partisan redistricting? What should have been obvious for years is that nonpartisan districting cannot survive on a state-by-state basis. In 2021, Democrats proposed a way out of the dilemma. The For the People Act would have required independent commissions to draw congressional district lines in every state. All Democrats but one voted for the bill. All Republicans opposed it. A Republican filibuster in the Senate killed it. If Republicans want fair districting, they can wipe away their crocodile tears and join in mandating an end to gerrymandering nationwide. Otherwise, let's hear no more mock indignation over the fact that Democrats have the audacity to fight back. And here are some letters about posting the 10 Commandments in classrooms. This is a letter from Toronto. What's the difference between teaching the Bible as literature and posting the 10 Commandments in a classroom? Teaching the Bible as literature is no different from teaching Shakespeare's plays. It makes no claims about the religious authority of the Bible, nor does it treat the biblical narrative as true. Such things are unconnected to gaining an appreciation of the Bible as a work of literature. In stark contrast, posting the Ten Commandments in a public school classroom gives the unmistakable impression that they are authoritative and have the endorsement of the state. Indeed, it is the clear intention of the Texas law to communicate this message to both public school students and the public at large. This is why two lower courts rightly struck down the law as a violation of the First Amendment's Establishment Clause, and it is why the Supreme Court must reverse the appellate court's decision to uphold the law. And here's one from New Jersey. You report that the Texas law was part of a push to infuse Christianity into public schools. But the Ten Commandments can hardly be considered just Christian, since they were given to Moses some 1,500 years before there were any Christians and were intended for a wandering group of Semitic people. If anything, they could be considered Hebraic. Posting them is not likely to have any influence in any case. Texas and Americans in general, most of whom would surely be familiar with these prescriptions, have gleefully violated each of them every day since colonists and slave ships arrived on our shores and continue to ignore them. Requiring that they be posted conspicuously in every schoolroom does appear unconstitutional, but they won't hurt anybody. A letter from Chappaqua, New York. Quote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, according to the First Amendment. The law in Texas requiring conspicuous display of the Ten Commandments in classrooms is clearly an establishment of Judeo-Christian religious doctrine. It's unconstitutional. Would the appeals court and the cheering officials and religious groups also endorse the display of Sharia law? Why can't they stick with rules of basic civility and ethics and promote age-appropriate discussions of their sources, their ubiquity, and the variations across civilizations? And here's a letter about an article by Bret Stephens called How to Save Academia. Mr. Stephens notes that the Yale Commissioned Report on Trust in Academia found that registered Democrats outnumber Republicans 36-1 across the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, the Law School, and the School of Management at Yale. I expect these numbers would be roughly the same at Columbia, where I have worked for 4 decades. Back in the 1980s and 90s, though, there were many conservatives and Republicans in the Earth Sciences Institute where I work. They're hard to find now. What happened was the shift of the conservative movement and the Republican Party away from a belief in evidence-based policy, scientific inquiry, and following the facts. The nation's most powerful Republicans once acted decisively on matters of science in the public interest. In 1970, President Richard Nixon signed into law the Clean Air Act. In 1987, President Ronald Reagan ushered in the Montreal Protocol, a multinational treaty that saved the planet from the dire consequences of ozone depletion. Since then, beginning with President George W. Bush, who withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol in 2001, the Republican Party and conservatives have become ever more hostile to scientific facts, evidence-based policy, and the research that underpins them. Now we have a Republican president who lies regularly, supported by an administration that has no respect for even the most basic facts, all rubber-stamped by a supine Republican Congress. Republicans have used this power to conduct an assault on scientific research in both universities and the federal government that has disrupted or ended countless important studies. They continue to aggressively set and promote dangerous environmental and health policies. A scientist who votes Republican risks handing power to people determined to ignore and undermine science. That said, I know that many of my colleagues in academia have views of social and economic policy that do not align easily with the Democratic Party. If the Republican Party were to once again embrace the value of science, research, and facts, then I am sure some of my colleagues would drift back to them. Until then, scientists and academia will overwhelmingly lean Democratic. And you've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times, on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. This is Ted. I enjoyed doing this reading. Actually, I thought the articles were better than last week's, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll speak with you next week. Look forward to it. Bye.